Picture this. 5,000 years ago, while most of the world was still figuring out how to make bronze tools, a civilization was already emerging along the banks of the Yellow River that would become the longest continuous civilization in human history. Today, that civilization spans nearly a quarter of the world's population, controls the second largest economy on Earth, and has survived more dynasties, invasions, famines, and revolutions than any other nation. This is China, and its story is unlike anything else in human history. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. China has been ruled by over 20 different dynasties across 5 millennia, each one rising to incredible heights before crashing down in spectacular fashion, only for another to rise from the ashes. We're talking about empires that built walls you can see from space, invented gunpowder and paper, created philosophies that still guide billions of people today, and amassed wealth that made European kings look like peasants. What you're about to discover isn't just a history lesson. It's the epic saga of how a collection of warring tribes along a muddy river became the Middle Kingdom, survived Mongol invasions, built the most advanced maritime fleet in the world centuries before Columbus, and somehow managed to maintain their cultural identity through conquest, colonization, and communist revolution. By the end of this series, you'll understand how China went from ancient to modern superpower, and why their kingdom's 5,000-year journey holds the keys to understanding the future of our world. The story begins in the mists of prehistory, around 3000 BCE, in the fertile valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. These weren't just any rivers. They were the lifeblood of what would become Chinese civilization, providing rich soil for agriculture and natural highways for trade and communication. But these rivers were also unpredictable monsters, flooding without warning and changing course like nature's own wrecking ball. Archaeological evidence shows us that by 2700 BCE, sophisticated communities were already thriving in these river valleys. They weren't just farming and making pottery. These early Chinese were developing complex social hierarchies, creating intricate jade ornaments, and most importantly, they were beginning to develop a writing system that would become the foundation of Chinese culture. The oracle bones discovered at sites like Anyang reveal a civilization already obsessed with divination, ancestor worship, and the mandate of heaven. Now here's where things get really interesting. While other ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia and Egypt were building their empires through conquest and slavery, early China was developing something completely different. They created a system where power came not just from military might, but from moral authority and divine approval. This concept, known as the Mandate of Heaven, would become the cornerstone of Chinese political philosophy for the next 5,000 years. The Mandate of Heaven wasn't just political propaganda, it was a revolutionary idea that said rulers only had the right to govern as long as they maintained virtue and served the people well. Natural disasters, famines, and social unrest were seen as signs that the heavens had withdrawn their support. This meant that rebellion against a corrupt ruler wasn't just acceptable, it was a sacred duty. This single concept would drive the rise and fall of every Chinese dynasty that followed. But before we dive into the dynasties themselves, we need to talk about the legendary figures who supposedly laid the foundation for all of Chinese civilization. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, is considered the ancestor of all Chinese people. According to legend, he ruled from 2697 to 2597 BCE and introduced everything from the calendar to traditional Chinese medicine. Whether he actually existed is debatable, but his importance to Chinese identity cannot be overstated. Then came Yu the Great, the legendary founder of the first Chinese dynasty. The story goes that Yu spent 13 years controlling massive floods along the Yellow River, barely taking time to return home to see his family. His dedication to serving the people earned him such respect that he was chosen to rule, establishing the Xia dynasty around 2070 BCE. What makes this story fascinating isn't whether it's literally true, but what it tells us about Chinese values. Leadership through service, sacrifice for the common good, and the taming of nature through human ingenuity would become recurring themes throughout Chinese history. The Xia dynasty represents the transition from prehistory to recorded history in China. Archaeological evidence for the Xia is limited, but recent discoveries at sites like Erlitou suggest a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization with advanced metallurgy, elaborate palaces, and complex social organization. The Xia supposedly ruled for over 400 years, establishing many of the political and cultural traditions that would define China for millennia. According to traditional accounts, the Xia dynasty fell when its last ruler, King Ji, became corrupt and tyrannical. The heavens withdrew their mandate, and a new leader emerged to claim the throne. This leader was Tang of Shang, who founded the Shang dynasty around 1600 BCE. This wasn't just a change of leadership. It was the first recorded example of dynastic transition in Chinese history, establishing a pattern that would repeat dozens of times over the next 4,000 years. The Shang dynasty is where Chinese history really begins to come alive because we have actual written records. The Shang developed the first fully formed Chinese writing system, created stunning bronze artifacts that still take your breath away, and established many of the religious and cultural practices that would define Chinese civilization. They built magnificent cities, developed sophisticated military technology, and created art that combined power with beauty in ways that influenced Chinese aesthetics for centuries. But what made the Shang truly remarkable was their approach to governance and religion. They created a complex system of ancestor worship that made dead kings almost as powerful as living ones. Royal tombs weren't just burial sites. They were elaborate underground palaces complete with servants, weapons, and treasures needed for the afterlife. The famous tomb of Lady Fu Hao, discovered in 1976, contained over 460 bronze objects, 750 jade pieces, and evidence of human sacrifice on a scale that reveals the awesome power of Shang royalty. The Shang also perfected the art of oracle bone divination. Royal diviners would carve questions into turtle shells and ox bones, then heat them until they cracked. The pattern of cracks was interpreted as messages from the ancestors and gods. These oracle bones give us incredible insight into Shang concerns: when to plant crops, whether to go to war, what the weather would be like, and how to maintain the favour of the spirits. It's like having a direct window into the minds of people who lived over 3,000 years ago. Military innovation was another Shang strength. They developed horse-drawn chariots that gave them a massive advantage over their enemies. Shang armies were organized with disciplined infantry, skilled archers, and elite chariot warriors who could strike fast and hard. Their bronze weapons were works of art that could also split skulls and pierce armor. Archaeological evidence shows that Shang military campaigns extended influence across much of northern China, creating a network of client states and tribute-paying vassals. The Shang capital at Anyang was a wonder of the ancient world. The royal palace complex covered over 100 acres and included ceremonial halls, residential quarters, workshops, and storage facilities. The city was protected by massive earthen walls and surrounded by suburbs where craftsmen, merchants, and farmers lived. The level of urban planning and organisation required to build and maintain such a city reveals a sophisticated state apparatus centuries ahead of its time. But like all Chinese dynasties, the Shang carried the seeds of their own destruction. Over time, the kings became more focused on luxury and ritual than on effective governance. The cost of maintaining elaborate courts and massive construction projects strained the economy. Regional lords grew increasingly independent, and barbarian tribes pressed against the borders. Natural disasters struck, and the people began to question whether the heavens still supported their rulers. The end came around 1046 BCE, when a coalition of tribes led by the Zhou attacked the Shang capital. The last Shang king, Dixin, was described in later Zhou accounts as a monster who built torture devices for fun and filled a lake with wine for orgies. Whether these accounts are true or just propaganda written by the victors, they served an important purpose: They justified the Zhou conquest by painting it as heaven's judgment against a corrupt dynasty. The Zhou victory wasn't just a military conquest, it was a complete transformation of Chinese political philosophy. The Zhou took the concept of the mandate of heaven and made it the cornerstone of their legitimacy. They argued that heaven had withdrawn its support from the corrupt Shang and transferious Zhou. This wasn't it to the vert just convenient propaganda. It was a revolutionary idea that would shape Chinese political thought for the next 3,000 years. The Zhou dynasty, which would rule China for nearly 800 years, represented both the pinnacle of ancient Chinese civilization and its greatest period of political fragmentation. The early Zhou kings ruled from their capital in the Wei River Valley and extended their control across much of northern China through a feudal system that granted land to nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. This feudal system worked brilliantly in the beginning. Zhou kings granted fiefs to relatives and allies, creating a network of loyal vassals who shared power and responsibility. The system was held together by elaborate rituals, shared cultural values, and the ever-present threat of barbarian invasion. For several centuries, this arrangement brought peace, prosperity, and cultural development to much of China. The Zhou made crucial innovations in government, philosophy, and technology. They developed more sophisticated administrative systems, created detailed legal codes, and established standardized weights and measures. Zhou craftsmen perfected ironworking, revolutionizing both agriculture and warfare. Zhou philosophers began asking fundamental questions about human nature, good government, and the relationship between heaven and earth that would eventually produce Confucianism and Taoism. The Zhou period also witnessed one of the most important technological revolutions in human history. The mastery of ironworking didn't just give the Chinese better weapons and tools, it transformed their entire relationship with the natural world. Iron ploughs could break tougher soil, iron axes could clear forests faster, and iron weapons could pierce bronze armor like paper. This technological leap allowed the Chinese to expand into new territories, support larger populations, and build more complex societies. But here's where the Zhou story takes a dramatic turn. Success bred its own problems. As the centuries passed, the feudal lords who owed allegiance to the Zhou king grew more powerful and independent. Distance from the capital meant less direct control. Local lords began thinking of themselves as rulers rather than vassals. The bonds of loyalty that held the system together started to fray like an old rope under too much weight. The crisis came to a head in 771 BCE, with an event that sounds like something out of a soap opera. King Yu of Zhou had become infatuated with a beautiful concubine named Baozi. The problem was that Baozi rarely smiled, which apparently drove the king to distraction. In his desperation to make her happy, King Yu came up with what seemed like a brilliant idea. He would light the beacon fires used to warn of barbarian attacks, summoning his loyal vassals to defend the capital. When they arrived ready for battle and found no enemies, Baozi would laugh at the joke. The plan worked perfectly. Baozi laughed, the king was delighted, and apparently nobody thought about the long-term consequences of crying wolf. When real barbarian tribes actually attacked the Zhou capital, King Yu lit the beacon fires again. But this time, the feudal lords assumed it was another prank and stayed home. The barbarians overran the capital, killed King Yu, and effectively ended centralized Zhou power. This disaster marked the beginning of what historians call the Eastern Zhou period, when the royal court moved east to Luoyang and never recovered its former authority. The Zhou kings continued to exist, but they were now little more than ceremonial figureheads. Real power belonged to the regional lords who carved up China among themselves and began the long, bloody process of fighting for ultimate supremacy. What followed was one of the most chaotic and creative periods in Chinese history. The spring and autumn period from 770 to 476 BCE saw hundreds of small states locked in constant warfare, diplomacy, and intrigue. It was like medieval Europe, but with more philosophy and better food. These weren't random barbarian raids or simple power grabs. This was sophisticated political competition between highly developed states, each trying to create the most effective government, the strongest military, and the most prosperous economy. The competition was fierce and often brutal, but it also drove innovation at an unprecedented pace. States that couldn't adapt quickly enough simply disappeared from the map. Those that survived did so by developing new military technologies, more efficient administrative systems, and more effective ways of mobilizing their populations. It was evolutionary pressure applied to human civilization, and the results were spectacular. Military innovation exploded during this period. The Chinese developed crossbows that could punch through armor at distances that made traditional archery look like throwing pebbles. They created sophisticated siege engines that could batter down the walls of any city. Cavalry became more important as states learned to breed better horses and develop more effective riding techniques. Iron weapons became standardized and mass-produced, turning warfare into an industrial process. But the real revolution was happening in the realm of ideas. The political chaos of the spring and autumn period created a market for new philosophies, and brilliant thinkers emerged to meet the demand. These weren't ivory tower academics writing for other scholars. These were practical philosophers trying to solve real-world problems of governance, ethics, and social organization. The most influential of these thinkers was a man named Confucius, better known to the world as Confucius. Born in 551 BCE in the small state of Lu, Confucius lived through some of the most turbulent decades of the spring and autumn period. He watched governments rise and fall, saw good men corrupted by power, and witnessed the suffering that political chaos brought to ordinary people. His response was to develop a philosophy that would transform Chinese civilization forever. Confucius believed that good government started with good people, and that good people were created through education, ritual, and moral cultivation. He taught that rulers should lead by moral example rather than force, that social harmony came from everyone fulfilling their proper roles, and that respect for tradition and ancestors provided the foundation for a stable society. His ideas about education, government, and ethics would influence Chinese thinking for the next 2.5 millennia. But Confucius wasn't the only game in town. The political chaos of the period produced a flowering of philosophical schools that approached the same basic problems from radically different angles. Laozi, the legendary founder of Taoism, taught that the best government governed least, and that human happiness came from living in harmony with the natural flow of the universe. His philosophy emphasized spontaneity, simplicity, and the avoidance of excessive ambition or control. Then there was Mozi, who preached universal love and utilitarian ethics centuries before European philosophers discovered these concepts. Mozi argued that actions should be judged by their consequences rather than their motives, and that a good ruler should care equally for all people, regardless of their social status or family connections. His ideas were radical for their time and influenced later Chinese thinking about social justice and good government. The legalists took a completely different approach. Thinkers like Shang and Han argued that human beings were naturally selfish and could only be controlled through clear laws, consistent punishments, and strong central authority. They believed that moral education was a waste of time and that effective government required abandoning Confucian idealism in favour of harsh but predictable legal systems. These philosophical debates weren't just academic exercises. They were competing blueprints for how to organise human society, and the states that could implement them most effectively gained crucial advantages over their rivals. The competition between different approaches to government, law, and social organisation drove innovation in ways that peaceful times never could have achieved. The spring and autumn period also saw remarkable developments in science, technology, and culture. Chinese astronomers created detailed star maps and developed more accurate calendars. Engineers built sophisticated irrigation systems that could support larger populations and more intensive agriculture. craftsmen perfected techniques for making silk, lacquer, and ceramics that would become hallmarks of Chinese civilization. Artists and poets created works that captured both the beauty and the violence of their turbulent age. But perhaps most importantly, this period established the intellectual foundations of Chinese civilization. The competition between Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, and other philosophical schools created a rich tradition of debate and inquiry that would influence Chinese thinking for millennia. Unlike other ancient civilizations that relied primarily on religious authority or military force to maintain order, the Chinese developed sophisticated theories about human nature, good government, and social organization that could be tested, refined, and adapted to changing circumstances. As the spring and autumn period drew to a close around 476 BCE, the political landscape had been completely transformed. Hundreds of small states had been consolidated into about a dozen major powers, each controlling significant territory and population. The old feudal system was dead, replaced by more centralized governments that could mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. The stage was set for the final act of ancient Chinese political development, the Warring States period. The Warring States period from 475 to 221 BCE was like the spring and autumn period on steroids. The remaining major powers threw off all pretense of loyalty to the Zhou king and began an all-out struggle for control of China. This wasn't just about territorial expansion anymore. It was about creating a unified empire that could bring peace and order to the Chinese world. The stakes had never been higher and the competition had never been more intense. The 7 major powers that emerged from this consolidation were unlike anything the world had seen before. Qin in the West had transformed itself into a military machine through legalist reforms. Chu in the south controlled vast territories and commanded fierce loyalty from its people. Wei, Zhou, and Han had carved up the old Jin state and now competed with each other as much as with outside powers. Yan in the northeast controlled crucial trade routes and maintained an independent streak that drove its neighbors crazy. And Qi in the east had become the wealthiest state through commerce and innovation. Each of these powers represented a different experiment in statecraft. They were like competing laboratories testing different approaches to the fundamental problems of human organization. The results of these experiments would determine not just who ruled China, but what kind of civilization China would become. Qin had embraced legalism with a vengeance that shocked even other warring states. Under the guidance of the brilliant reformer Shang, Qin had abolished the old aristocratic system entirely and replaced it with a meritocracy based on military service and agricultural production. Every aspect of society was regulated by law, and the punishments for breaking those laws were so severe that crime virtually disappeared. Soldiers fought with desperate courage because cowardice meant death, while valor brought titles, land, and social advancement. The Qin system was brutally efficient. They divided their territory into administrative districts controlled by appointed officials rather than hereditary nobles. They standardized weights, measures, and currency to facilitate trade. They built roads and canals that connected distant regions and allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies. Most importantly, they created a professional army that was larger, better trained and more disciplined than anything their enemies could field. But Qin's greatest weapon wasn't their army or their laws. It was their willingness to completely abandon traditional Chinese values when those values interfered with state power. While other states still honored ancient customs and showed respect for Zhou traditions, Qin pragmatically discarded anything that didn't contribute to military strength or economic efficiency. This shocked their contemporaries, but it also gave Qin crucial advantages in the life-or-death struggle for supremacy. Chu took a completely different approach. The largest of the warring states, Chu had never fully accepted Chinese cultural dominance and maintained many of its own traditions and customs. Chu rulers styled themselves as kings rather than dukes, rejected Zhou authority, and developed their own distinctive culture that blended Chinese influences with local traditions. They were masters of diplomacy and intrigue, constantly forming and breaking alliances to maintain the balance of power. Chu's military strength came from their ability to mobilize enormous armies from their vast population. Chu soldiers were known for their fierce fighting spirit and their loyalty to their homeland. The state also excelled in naval warfare, controlling much of the Yangtze River system and using their naval superiority to project power far from their borders. Chu poets and philosophers created works that rivaled anything produced in other states, and their cultural influence spread far beyond their political boundaries. The three states of Wei, Zhou, and Han represented the most sophisticated attempts to reform traditional Chinese government without completely abandoning Chinese values. Wei had become the most militarily advanced state through constant innovation in weapons and tactics. They were the first to develop effective cavalry units and the first to use crossbows on a large scale. Wei armies were smaller than those of Chu or Qin, but they were arguably the most professional and effective fighting forces of their time. Zhou had turned necessity into strength by learning to fight like their barbarian neighbours. Facing constant pressure from nomadic tribes on their northern borders, Zhou had adopted nomadic fighting techniques and created the most effective cavalry force in China. King Wuling of Zhou had scandalized Chinese conservatives by ordering his soldiers to wear barbarian-style trousers instead of traditional Chinese robes, but the practical advantages were undeniable. Zhou cavalry could outmaneuver and outfight any opponent. Han had taken a different path, focusing on economic development and technological innovation. Han craftsmen were renowned throughout China for their skill in metalworking, and Han merchants had created trading networks that extended far beyond Chinese borders. The state had also become a center of learning, attracting philosophers and scholars from across the Chinese world. Han rulers tried to balance military necessity with Confucian ideals, creating a government that was effective but not tyrannical. Yan had survived by playing the other powers against each other while maintaining their independence through diplomatic skill and strategic alliances. Located on the northeastern frontier, Yan had developed strong military traditions through constant warfare with barbarian tribes. They had also become masters of espionage and assassination, using these unconventional weapons to level the playing field against larger opponents. Qi had chosen yet another path, becoming the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated of the warring states. The Qi capital of Linzi was probably the largest city in the world at the time, with a Mei population that have exceeded 500,000 people. Qi rulers patronized learning and the arts, creating academies that attracted scholars from across China and fed beyond states' wealth came from trade, manufacturing, and intensive agriculture that supported dense populations. But wealth and culture couldn't compensate for military weakness. As the Warring States period progressed, it became increasingly clear that economic power without military strength was a recipe for conquest. The other states looked at Qi's prosperity with hungry eyes and began planning how to divide its territories among themselves. The intensity of competition during the Warring States period drove innovation at a pace that wouldn't be matched until the Industrial Revolution. States that couldn't keep up with military and technological developments simply disappeared. The pressure was relentless, and the stakes kept getting higher as consolidation reduced the number of major players. Military technology exploded in sophistication and lethality. The Chinese perfected the crossbow, creating weapons that could kill armored opponents at ranges that made traditional archery obsolete. They developed sophisticated siege engines that could batter down even the strongest fortifications. Cavalry became increasingly important as states learned to breed better horses and develop more effective tactics for mounted warfare. But the most important military innovation was organizational rather than technological. The warring states created the first truly professional armies in human history. These weren't feudal levies or seasonal militias. They were full-time soldiers who trained constantly, lived in military camps, and devoted their entire lives to warfare. The scale was unprecedented. Armies of hundreds of thousands of men clashing in battles that determined the fate of millions. The logistics required to support these massive armies drove innovations in agriculture, transportation, and administration that transformed Chinese society. States had to develop efficient tax collection systems to pay for their military expenses. They built road networks and canal systems to move troops and supplies quickly across vast distances. They created standardized equipment and weapons that could be mass-produced and maintained by military workshops. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically as states learned to support larger populations and extract more resources from their territories. New crops were introduced, irrigation systems were expanded, and farming techniques were refined to squeeze every possible advantage from the land. The Chinese during this period probably achieved the highest agricultural productivity per acre of any civilization in the ancient world. Ironworking reached new levels of sophistication as military demand drove constant innovation. Chinese metallurgists developed techniques for creating steel that was harder and more durable than anything produced elsewhere. They learned to mass-produce weapons and tools that were both effective and affordable. The quality of Chinese iron and steel work during the Warring States period wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. The constant warfare also drove developments in medicine and engineering. Military surgeons learned to treat wounds and diseases that would have been fatal in peacetime. Engineers developed new techniques for building fortifications, bridges, and siege engines. The accumulated knowledge from decades of warfare created a technological base that would serve Chinese civilization for centuries. But perhaps the most important innovation was governmental. The warring states were forced to develop administrative systems that could effectively control large territories and populations, while maintaining the flexibility to respond quickly to military threats. They created bureaucracies staffed by educated professionals rather than hereditary nobles. They developed legal systems that could handle complex commercial and criminal cases. They established communication networks that allowed central governments to coordinate activities across vast distances. The philosophical developments of this period were equally revolutionary. The life and death struggle between states created intense pressure to find the most effective approaches to government, law, and social organization. Philosophers weren't writing audiences. For academics, they were competing to create practical solutions to real-world problems. Their ideas were tested in the crucible of warfare, and only the most effective approaches survived. Legalism gained ground during this period because it offered concrete solutions to the problems of warfare and governance. Legalist thinkers like Han Feizi developed sophisticated theories about how to create strong states through clear laws, consistent punishments, and centralized authority. Their ideas were harsh but effective, and states that implemented legalist reforms often gained crucial advantages over their rivals. Confucian thought evolved in response to the challenges of the time. Later Confucian philosophers like Mencius developed more sophisticated theories about human nature and good government. They argued that effective rule required not just moral leadership, but also practical policies that could improve people's lives and maintain social stability. Their ideas about education, meritocracy, and benevolent government would eventually triumph, but not until China had been unified through legalist methods. The military strategists of this period created works that are still studied today. Sun Tzu's art of war emerged from this environment of constant conflict and sophisticated strategic thinking. His insights about the importance of intelligence, deception, and psychological warfare reflected the reality of warring states' military practice. These weren't abstract theories, but practical guides based on bitter experience. As the 3rd century BCE began, it was becoming clear that the Warring States period was approaching its climax. Decades of warfare had eliminated the weaker states and created a situation where only the strongest survivors remained. The question was no longer whether China would be unified, but which state would achieve that unification and what kind of government the unified empire would have. The answer was about to emerge from the western mountains of Qin, where a remarkable ruler was preparing to write his name across Chinese history in letters of fire and blood. His name was Ying Zheng, and he would become known to history as the first emperor of China. The stage was set for the final act of ancient Chinese political development, and the consequences would echo through the next 2,000 years of Chinese civilization. The transformation of Yingzheng from a teenage king into the most powerful ruler in Chinese history is a story that reads like something out of a political thriller. Born in 259 BCE, he inherited the throne of Qin at just 13 years old, but the real power was wielded by his regent and the brilliant chancellor Liu Buwei. What nobody could have predicted was that this young king would grow up to become not just another warring states ruler, but the man who would end the age of division forever and create the template for Chinese imperial government that would last over 2,000 years. The early years of Yingzheng's reign were marked by palace intrigue that would make Game of Thrones look tame. His mother, Queen Dowager Zhou, had begun an affair with a man named Lao Ai, who had been smuggled into the palace disguised as a eunuch. When Lao Ai attempted to stage a coup in 238 BCE, the young king moved with ruthless efficiency. He crushed the rebellion, executed Lao Ai and his co-conspirators, and banished his own mother from the capital. This wasn't just teenage drama playing out in the palace. It was the first sign Yingzheng possessed that the cold calculation and absolute determination that would define his reign. By 230 BCE, the king of Qin was ready to begin his campaign of conquest. But this wasn't going to be just another round of warring states warfare. Yingzheng had a vision that no Chinese ruler had ever seriously attempted to implement. He wanted to conquer not just his immediate neighbors, but every Chinese state, eliminate the entire dial system, and create a unified empire, FEU, under absolute central control. It was an audacious plan that required military genius, administrative innovation, and sheer force of will on a scale that defied imagination. The Qin war machine that Yingzheng unleashed on his enemies was unlike anything the Chinese world had ever seen. Years of legalist reforms had created an army where promotion came through merit rather than birth, where cowardice meant death and valor brought tangible rewards. Qin soldiers fought with a desperation and discipline that shocked their enemies. They collected the heads of fallen enemies to prove their kills and earn advancement. They followed orders without question because the alternative was execution. Most importantly, they believed in their mission with a fanaticism that made them nearly unstoppable. The conquest began with Han in 230 BCE, the weakest of the remaining major powers. Han had tried to maintain its independence through diplomatic maneuvering and alliance building, but when the Qin armies crossed their borders, resistance crumbled within months. The speed of the victory sent shockwaves through the remaining states. This wasn't just another territorial grab. The Qin had completely absorbed Han, eliminated its ruling class, and integrated its territory into their administrative system. It was total war aimed at total victory. Zhou fell next in 228 BCE, despite their reputation as the most formidable military power among the northern states. The Zhou had created the most effective cavalry force in China and had survived decades of warfare through military excellence and strategic cunning. But they couldn't match the sheer scale and organization of the Qin war machine. When their capital fell, King Qian of Zhou was captured and executed, and the Zhou military system was dismantled completely. The Qin weren't just conquering territory. They were systematically eliminating the political and military structures that had defined the warring states period. The fall of Wei in 225 BCE demonstrated the technological and engineering superiority that gave Qin crucial their enemies. Wei had 4 advantages over their capital, with what they believed were impregnable defences, but Qin engineers diverted the Yellow River to flood the city. After 3 months of siege, the walls collapsed and Wei surrendered. It was a stunning demonstration of how Qin combined military innovation with ruthless pragmatism to overcome any obstacle. Chu posed the greatest challenge to Qin expansion. The largest and most populous of the warring states, Chu had vast resources, fierce military traditions, and a culturalistic Chinese identity that had wrested influence for centuries. The first Qin invasion of Chu in 224 BCE ended in disaster when a Qin army of 200,000 men was defeated and its general killed. But Yingzheng learned from failure in ways that his enemies never expected. He recalled his defeated general and replaced him with Wang Jian, who demanded an army of 600,000 men for the second invasion. Wang Jian's conquest of Chu in 223 BCE was a masterpiece of strategic patience and overwhelming force. Rather than rushing into battle, he spent months training his massive army, securing his supply lines, and wearing down Chu resistance through constant raids and psychological offensive pressure. When he finally launched his main, Chu resistance collapsed like a house of cards. The Chu king was captured, their capital destroyed, and their entire political system eliminated. The largest obstacle to Qin unification had been removed. Yan and Qi, the last remaining independent states, fell in quick succession. Yan had tried to eliminate Yingzheng through assassination, sending Jing Ke on his famous but failed mission to kill the Qin king. The attempt only strengthened Yingzheng's resolve and provided justification for the total destruction of Yan political independence. Qi surrendered without a fight in 221 BCE, bringing the warring states period to an end and making Yingzheng the undisputed master of China. But conquest was only the beginning. The real challenge was creating a unified government that could control the vast territories and diverse populations that had been brought under Qin rule. The traditional Chinese approach would have been to establish a feudal system with local nobles governing their territories under loose central oversight. Yingzheng chose a radically different path. He would create the world's first truly centralized empire, with all power flowing from a single source and all important decisions made by a single ruler. The political revolution that followed was as dramatic as the military conquest that preceded it. Yingzheng abolished the feudal system entirely, eliminating the hereditary nobility that had dominated Chinese politics for over 1,000 years. He divided the empire into 36 administrative districts called commanderies, each governed by appointed officials who served at the emperor's pleasure and could be removed at any time. These officials were rotated frequently to prevent them from building local power bases, and they were monitored by a network of inspectors who reported directly to the central government. But political unification was only part of Yingzheng's vision. He understood that creating a truly unified empire required standardization on a scale never before attempted. The diversity that had characterized the warring states period had to be eliminated and replaced with uniformity that would make the empire function as a single unit. The scope of this standardization project was breathtaking in its ambition and ruthless in its implementation. The Qin standardized weights and measures throughout the empire, eliminating the confusion that had hampered trade and administration. They standardized currency, replacing the bewildering variety of coins and payment systems with a single imperial standard. They standardized the gauge of cartwheels so that vehicles from one region could travel on roads built in another. Most importantly, they standardized the writing system, creating a uniform script that could be understood throughout the empire, regardless of local dialects or languages. The standardization of writing was perhaps the most revolutionary reform in Chinese history. For the first time, a farmer in the far south could read a government decree written in the north. Merchants could conduct business across vast distances, using contracts that meant the same thing everywhere could share. Scholars' ideas without worrying about regional variations in script. The creation of a uniform writing system didn't just facilitate administration and commerce, it created the intellectual foundation for a truly unified Chinese civilization. Road building under the first emperor was another marvel of ancient engineering and organization. The Qin constructed over 4,000 miles of imperial highways that connected the capital to every corner of the empire. These weren't just dirt paths widened for military use. They were engineered roadways with standardized widths, bridges, rest stations, and maintenance systems. The roads allowed rapid movement of troops and officials, facilitated trade and communication, and symbolized the unity of the empire in ways that everyone could see and use. The most famous construction project of the first emperor was, of course, the Great Wall. But the wall that tourists visit today was built much later by the Ming dynasty. The Qin Wall was actually renovation, a massive and connection of existing defensive walls built by the northern warring states. The first emperor ordered these separate fortifications to be linked and extended into a continuous barrier that would protect China from nomadic invasions. The scale of the project was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of workers, including soldiers, peasants, and prisoners, labored for years to complete the wall. The human cost was enormous, but the strategic benefits were undeniable. The Great Wall wasn't just a military fortification, it was a powerful symbol of Chinese unity and determination. The wall said to the world that China was now a unified empire, capable of mobilizing resources on an unprecedented scale. It demonstrated that the Chinese would go to extraordinary lengths to defend their civilization. Most importantly, it established a clear boundary between Chinese and barbarian worlds that would influence Chinese thinking about their place in the world for centuries. But the first emperor's most controversial reform was his approach to intellectual and cultural unification. The diversity of thought that had flourished during the Warring States period was seen as a threat to imperial unity. In 213 BCE, acting on the ordered the burning advice Sai, the emperor of his chancellor Li, of books that were deemed subversive or unnecessary. Private libraries were destroyed, scholars who possessed banned books were executed, and only technical works on subjects like medicine, agriculture, and divination were allowed to survive. The burning of the books was followed by an even more shocking act. When Confucian scholars continued to criticize imperial policies and call for a return to ancient traditions, the first emperor ordered 460 of them to be buried alive. This brutal ration of intellectual suppant sent a clear message that the unified empire would tolerate no challenges to imperial authority, no matter how scholarly or well-intentioned they might be. These harsh measures succeeded in eliminating organized opposition to Qin rule, but they also created deep resentment among the educated classes who had provided intellectual leadership during the Warring States period. The first emperor had unified China through force and fear, but he had not won the hearts and minds of his people. This would prove to be a fatal weakness that would destroy his dynasty almost as quickly as it had been created. The administrative system created by the first emperor was revolutionary in its efficiency and scope. The empire was governed by a complex bureaucracy that could collect taxes, conscript soldiers, organize labor projects, and maintain order across territories larger than modern Europe. Government officials were selected based on merit rather than birth, creating opportunities for advancement that had never existed under the feudal system. The legal system was codified and applied uniformly throughout the empire, replacing the chaotic patchwork of local customs and traditions. But the system's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. Everything depended on the emperor himself. All decisions were importantoed through the imperial court, all major policies required imperial approval, and all government officials served at the emperor's pleasure. This created unprecedented unity and efficiency, but it also meant that the entire system was vulnerable to imperial incompetence or the chaos that would follow imperial death. The first emperor understood this vulnerability and became obsessed with achieving personal immortality. He consulted alchemists and magicians, searched for elixirs of eternal life, and sponsored expeditions to find the legendary islands where supposed seals were to live. His quest for immortality became increasingly desperate as he aged, consuming vast resources and leading to increasingly erratic behavior. Ironically, his attempts to live forever may have hastened his death, as some historians believe he was poisoned by the mercury-based elixirs he consumed regularly. When the first emperor died in 210 BCE during a tour of his eastern provinces, the empire he had created began to unravel almost immediately. His death was kept secret for weeks while his advisors maneuvered for position. His designated heir was murdered, and a younger, weaker son was placed on the throne. The iron discipline that had held the Qin system together began to crack local as officials realized that imperial authority was no longer absolute. The second emperor, Qin, erect his share. Father's genius administration and his ruthless determination. Faced with growing unrest and administrative chaos, he relied increasingly on harsh punishments and arbitrary executions to maintain control. But fear without competence is a recipe for disaster. The empire that had been unified through superior organization and strategic vision began to fragment under incompetent leadership. Rebellions erupted across the empire as news of the first emperor's death spread, and his weaknesses became apparent. The first major uprising began in 209 BCE when Shang and Wu Guang, two low-ranking military officers, raised the banner of revolt rather than face execution for being late to their assigned posts. Their rebellion was quickly crushed, but it inspired dozens of other uprisings as people realized that Qin power was no longer invincible. The most significant rebellion was led by Xiang Yu, a nobleman from the former state of Chu who possessed both military genius and a burning desire for revenge against the Qin. Xiang Yu's forces won a series of stunning victories against Qin armies, culminating in the Battle of Julu, where he achieved one of the most decisive victories in Chinese military history. His tactics were so effective and his victories so complete that within months, the Qin military system collapsed entirely. But Xiang Yu wasn't only rebelled the leader with ambitions to rule China. Liu Bang, a peasant who had risen to become a minor Qin official, had also raised and was competing Army An for control of the empire. The relationship between these two men would determine the future of Chinese civilization. They were as different as two people could be. Xiang Yu was aristocratic, brilliant, and ruthless. Liu Bang was common-born, pragmatic, and surprisingly effective at winning people's loyalty. The competition of Xiang Yu and Liu Bang wasn't just a struggle between two ambitious generals. It represented a fundamental choice about what kind of government would replace the fallen Qin Empire. Xiang Yu wanted to restore the feudal system and recreate the world of the warring states. Liu Bang, despite his humble origins, understood that China had been permanently changed by Qin unification, and that any successful dynasty would have to build on Qin innovations, rather than simply rejecting them. The civil war that followed the fall of Qin lasted for 4 years and devastated much of China. Xiang Yu won most of the major battles through superior tactics and personal courage. He was probably the finest military commander in Chinese history, capable of achieving victory against impossible odds through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. But Liu Bang proved to be better at the political and strategic aspects of warfare. He recruited more allies, maintained better supply lines, and most importantly, offered a vision of the future that appealed to more people than Xiang Yu's backward-looking program. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Gaixia in 202 BCE, where Liu Bang's forces surrounded Xiang Yu's army and destroyed it through superior numbers and coordination. Xiang Yu's death marked the end of the civil war and the beginning of a new dynasty that would rule China for over 400 years. Liu Bang, now known as Emperor Gaozu of Han, had won the right to rebuild Chinese civilization on new foundations. The Han dynasty that emerged from this chaos would prove that the first emperor's vision of unified China was correct, even if his methods had been flawed. Emperor Gaozu and his successors kept the administrative system created by Qin, but softened its harsh edges with Confucian ideals of benevolent government. They maintained centralized control, but allowed more local autonomy. Most importantly, they created a synthesis of legalist efficiency and Confucian morality that would become the standard template for Chinese imperial government. The early Han emperors faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a country that had been devastated by years of warfare and harsh Qin policies. They had to restore agricultural production, rebuild cities and infrastructure, and most importantly, win the loyalty of a population that had suffered under both Qin tyranny and civil war chaos. Their success in meeting these challenges would establish the Han as one of the greatest dynasties in Chinese history and create the foundation for China's emergence as a world power. The reign of Emperor Wu, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, marked the transformation of Han China from a recovering regional power into a true empire that could project its influence across vast distances. Wu's reign saw Chinese armies march into Central Asia, Korea, and Vietnam, establishing Chinese power in regions that had never before been under unified control. But more importantly, his reign established the cultural and political patterns that would define Chinese civilization for the next 2,000 years. Emperor Wu's military campaigns weren't just about territorial China expansion. They were about establishing place in the world and demonstrating that Chinese civilization was superior to all others. The conquest of the western regions opened the Silk Road, connecting China to Central Asian and Mediterranean civilizations for the first time. Chinese silk, porcelain, and other luxury goods began flowing westwards, while horses, jade, and exotic foods flowed into China. These trade connections would make China wealthy and cosmopolitan in ways that transformed Chinese society. But the most important Han innovation was the creation of the imperial examination system, which would become the foundation of Chinese government for the next 2 millennia. Rather than appointing officials based on birth or personal connections, the Han began selecting bureaucrats based on their knowledge of Confucian classics and their ability to write essays on government policy. This created a professional civil service that was more competent and less corrupt than anything that had existed before. The examination system had profound implications for Chinese society. It meant that talented individuals from humble backgrounds could rise to positions of power and influence through education and merit. It created a shared intellectual culture among government officials throughout the empire. Most importantly, it tied the legitimacy of imperial government to Confucian ideals of moral leadership and benevolent rule. And the Han synthesis of legalist administrative efficiency and Confucian moral authority created a form of government that was both effective and legitimate. Unlike the Qin, which had ruled through fear alone, the Han won genuine support from their subjects by providing good government and economic prosperity. They proved that unified imperial rule could be both strong and benevolent, setting the standard for all future Chinese dynasties. The cultural achievements of the Han period were as impressive as their political successes. Han military COCC and historians like Sima Qian created the first comprehensive histories of China, establishing the narrative framework that Chinese would use to understand their past for centuries. Han poets and philosophers developed new forms of literature and refined Confucian thought in ways that influenced Chinese intellectual life for millennia. Han craftsmen perfected techniques for making silk, porcelain, and lacquerware that became symbols of Chinese civilization throughout the world. Perhaps most importantly, the Han created the concept of cultural Chineseness that transcended political boundaries. To be Chinese meant to participate in a civilization defined by Confucian values, Chinese writing, and shared historical memory. This cultural identity was so strong that it survived political fragmentation, foreign conquest, and revolutionary upheaval. Even today, the majority of Chinese people call themselves Han, acknowledging their connection to the dynasty that created the template for Chinese civilization over 2,000 years ago. But the Han dynasty's golden age couldn't last forever, and the very success that made them great also carried the seeds of their eventual downfall. By the 1st century CE, the empire had grown so vast and complex that governing it required resources on a scale that strained even China's enormous wealth. The imperial court had become a maze of competing factions, palace intrigue, and corruption that would make any modern political scandal look tame by comparison. The Han faced what historians now recognize as the classic imperial dilemma. Success bred expansion. Expansion required larger armies and bigger bureaucracies, and maintaining those armies and bureaucracies demanded ever-increasing taxes from a population that was already stretched to its limits. Add to this the natural disasters that periodically devastated Chinese agriculture, and you have a recipe for the kind of crisis that had toppled every previous dynasty. The reign of Emperor Ai from 7 to 1 BCE perfectly illustrated how imperial weakness could paralyze an entire empire. Ai was more interested in his male lovers than in governing, leaving real power in the hands of the Dong family, his grandmother's relatives who used their position to enrich themselves at the empire's expense. When natural disasters struck and the Yellow River changed course, flooding vast areas of northern China, the imperial response was paralyzed by court politics and financial constraints. But the most serious threat to Han rule came from an unexpected source: a Confucian scholar named Wang Mang who believed he could restore China's greatness by implementing radical reforms based on ancient texts. Wang Mang wasn't your typical usurper. He didn't seize power through military force or palace intrigue. Instead, he convinced much of the educated elite that the Han had lost the mandate of heaven, and that only he possessed the moral authority and classical knowledge needed to restore proper government. Wang Mang's rise to power reads like a political thriller written by someone who understood both Confucian philosophy and practical politics. He began as a trusted advisor to the imperial family, gradually accumulating influence through his reputation for integrity and learning. When the young Emperor Ping died in 6 CE, Wang Mang became regent for the infant heir apparent. By 9 CE, he had convinced enough people that the times demanded extraordinary measures, and he formally proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty called Qin, meaning new. The reforms that Wang Mang implemented were breathtaking in their scope and ambition. He nationalized all land and redistributed it to peasant farmers, abolishing the large estates that had concentrated wealth in the hands of a few powerful families. He outlawed slavery and established government monopolies on salt, iron, and alcohol to fund his social programs. He even attempted to stabilize prices through government intervention in markets, creating what may have been the world's first systematic attempt at economic planning. On paper, Wang Mang's reforms looked like solutions to all of China's problems. They would reduce inequality, increase government revenue, and restore the moral order that Confucian scholars believed was essential for good government. In practice, they were a disaster that nearly destroyed Chinese civilization. The land redistribution program created chaos in rural areas as peasants and landlords fought over property rights. The abolition of slavery disrupted labor systems without providing alternatives. Government monopolies led to shortages and black essential markets that made goods more expensive rather than less. But Wang Mang's greatest mistake was underestimating the practical challenges of governing an empire while simultaneously trying to revolutionize its entire economic and social system. His reforms required a level of administrative competence and resources that simply didn't exist. Local officials couldn't implement policies they didn't understand, and the central government lacked the means to enforce compliance across such vast territories. Within a few years, the empire was collapsing into chaos as natural disasters combined with administrative breakdown to create conditions that were ripe for rebellion. The rebellions that destroyed Wang Mang's dynasty were unlike anything China had seen before. The Red Eyebrows, a peasant movement that painted their faces to distinguish themselves from government forces, controlled vast areas of northern China and defeated imperial armies with a combination of desperation and superior local knowledge. The Green Woodsmen operated in the south, using guerrilla tactics to control territory and resources. Most dangerous of all was the movement led by Liu Shu, a member of the Han imperial family who claimed that his restoration would return China to the golden age of earlier Han rule. The civil wars that raged across China from 18 to 36 CE were devastating, beyond anything the country had experienced since the fall of Qin. Entire cities were destroyed, agricultural systems collapsed, and the population declined by millions through warfare, famine, and disease. Archaeological evidence suggests that some regions lost more than half their inhabitants during this period. It was a catastrophe that demonstrated how quickly Chinese civilization could unravel when central authority collapsed. Liu Shu's victory in 36 CE and his establishment of the Eastern Han dynasty marked one of the most remarkable recoveries in Chinese history. The new emperor, known posthumously as Emperor Guangwu, faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a country that had been devastated by decades of misrule and civil war. His success in meeting this challenge proved that Chinese imperial institutions were resilient to survive even the most severe crises, but only if they were led by competent rulers who understood both the possibilities and limitations of imperial power. The Eastern Han period from 25 to 220 CE saw the restoration and refinement of the governmental system that had made the earlier Han great. Emperor Guangwu and his successors rebuilt the imperial bureaucracy, restored agricultural production, and re-established Chinese authority over the frontier regions that had been lost during Wang Mang's reign. But they also learned from the disasters of the previous decades, implementing reforms that made the system more stable and responsive to changing conditions. One of the most important Eastern Han innovations was the expansion of the examination system to include more positions and more diverse forms of testing. This created opportunities for advancement that extended deeper into Chinese society, while also ensuring that government officials possessed the knowledge and skills needed for effective administration. The system wasn't perfect. It still favoured those wealthy enough to afford extensive education. But it was more meritocratic than anything that existed elsewhere in the ancient world. The Eastern Han also saw remarkable developments in science, technology, and culture that demonstrated the creative potential of Chinese civilization when it was given peace and stability. Zhang invented the first seismograph, a device that could detect earthquakes hundreds of miles away by using a sophisticated mechanism of bronze dragons and toads. Kailan perfected the process of making paper from plant fibers, creating a writing material that was cheaper and more practical than the silk and bamboo strips that had been used previously. Han medical knowledge advanced to levels that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. The Huangdi Neijing, or Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, compiled during this period, established the theoretical foundations of traditional Chinese medicine that are still used today. Chinese physicians developed sophisticated theories about the circulation of blood and vital energy, created detailed anatomical charts, and perfected surgical techniques that saved countless lives. But perhaps the most impressive Eastern Han achievement was the creation of historical and literary works that established the intellectual framework of Chinese civilization. Ban Gu's Book of Han set the standard for official histories that would be followed by every subsequent dynasty. The poetry of the Han period, particularly the fugue or rhyme prose compositions, created new forms of artistic expression that influenced Chinese literature for centuries. The Han also perfected the art of diplomacy, creating relationships with neighbouring kingdoms and nomadic tribes that extended Chinese influence far beyond the empire's formal borders. The tribute system that emerged during this period established China as the dominant power in East Asia, with smaller kingdoms acknowledging Chinese supremacy in exchange for trade privileges and protection. This system would remain the foundation of East Asian international relations until the arrival of European powers in the 19th century. Trade during the Eastern Han reached unprecedented levels as the Silk Road connected China to civilizations across Central Asia and into the Mediterranean world. Chinese merchants established communities in cities thousands of miles from home, while foreign traders brought new goods, ideas, and technologies to Chinese markets. This cultural exchange enriched Chinese civilization in ways that were both subtle and profound, introducing new foods, artistic styles, and religious concepts that gradually became part of Chinese culture. The introduction of Buddhism to China during the Eastern Han period was perhaps the most significant cultural development in Chinese history since the creation of the writing system. Buddhist missionaries from India brought with them not just religious teachings, but also new forms of art, architecture, and philosophy that would transform Chinese intellectual life. The process of translating Buddhist texts into Chinese required the development of new vocabulary and concepts that expanded the expressive capabilities of the Chinese language. But Buddhism's impact went far beyond language and art. Buddhist ideas about karma, reincarnation, and the nature of suffering provided Chinese people with new ways of understanding their place in the universe. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning that preserved and transmitted knowledge during periods of political chaos. Most importantly, Buddhism offered spiritual comfort to people facing the hardships and uncertainties of life in ways that traditional Chinese religions couldn't match. The synthesis of Buddhist and Chinese thought that emerged during the East and Han period created new philosophical schools that would influence Chinese thinking for centuries. Chinese Buddhism developed distinctive characteristics that reflected traditional Chinese values, while also incorporating Indian insights about the nature of reality and human consciousness. This wasn't just religious syncretism, it was the creation of entirely new ways of thinking about fundamental questions of human existence. The East and Han also witnessed the development of Chinese science and technology to levels that wouldn't be surpassed anywhere in the world for centuries. Chinese astronomers created detailed star maps and calculated the movements of planets with remarkable accuracy. They developed theories about the nature of eclipses and comets that were based on careful observation rather than supernatural superstition. Their calendars were so precise that they could predict celestial events years in advance. Chinese mathematics during the East and Han period produced innovations that were centuries ahead of developments elsewhere. The 9 chapters on the mathematical art compiled during this period contained solutions to problems involving fractions, square roots, and geometric calculations that European mathematicians wouldn't discover until the Renaissance. Chinese mathematicians also developed early versions of algebra and created methods for solving complex equations that were remarkably sophisticated. But the technological achievement that had the greatest impact on world history was the invention of paper by Kai Lun around 105 CE. This innovation didn't just make writing materials cheaper and more available, it revolutionized the way knowledge could be preserved and transmitted. Books became affordable for ordinary people, leading to higher literacy rates and the broader distribution of ideas. The printing technology that would later spread from China to the rest of the world was only possible because paper provided a suitable medium for mass production of texts. The military innovations of the East and Han period were equally impressive. Chinese engineers perfected the crossbow to the point where Han infantry could defeat cavalry forces that had dominated warfare for centuries. They developed sophisticated siege engines that could breach the strongest fortifications, and they created naval technologies that allowed Chinese fleets to project power across vast distances. The famous General Ban Chao used these military advantages to extend Chinese control deep into Central Asia, establishing protectorates that secured the Silk Road for Chinese merchants. Agricultural productivity during the East and Han reached levels that supported population densities unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. Chinese farmers developed new crop varieties, improved irrigation systems, and perfected farming techniques that could feed enormous populations even in difficult environmental conditions. The famous Dujiangyan irrigation system built during this period in Sichuan province is still in use today and continues to support millions of people. The governmental innovations of the East and Han created administrative systems that were copied by neighbouring kingdoms and influenced the development of bureaucratic institutions throughout East Asia. The Chinese civil service system, with its emphasis on merit-based selection and professional competence, provided a model for effective government that was far superior to the hereditary and military systems used elsewhere. The detailed records kept by Han administrators give us insights into ancient government practices that are unmatched by any other ancient civilization. But success bred its own problems. And by the 2nd century CE, the East and Han were facing many of the same challenges that had destroyed their predecessors. The empire had grown so large and complex that governing it required resources on a scale that strained even China's enormous capacity. Palace politics had become increasingly corrupt as powerful families competed for influence over weak emperors. Most dangerously, the military commanders needed to defend the frontiers were accumulating power and independence that threatened central authority. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE marked the beginning of the end for the Eastern Han dynasty. Led by Zhang, a charismatic leader who combined religious mysticism with social revolution, the Yellow Turbans appealed to peasants who were suffering under the burden of heavy taxes and corrupt officials. The rebellion spread across 8 provinces and attracted hundreds of thousands of followers who believed that Zhang possessed supernatural powers that would sweep away the old order and create a new golden age. The Han government's response to the Yellow Turban Rebellion revealed just how weak the dynasty had become. Imperial armies could only defeat the rebels by relying on regional warlords who demanded virtual independence in exchange for their support. The victory over the Yellow Turbans came at the cost of fragmenting imperial authority among dozens of military commanders who owed only nominal allegiance to the emperor in Luoyang. The assassination of Emperor Ling in 189 CE triggered a succession crisis that destroyed what remained of Han's central authority. General Zhou seized control of the capital and the last Han emperor, but his brutal rule provoked a coalition of regional commanders to march on Luoyang. When Zhou was assassinated by his own subordinates in 192 CE, the empire collapsed into chaos as warlords fought each other for control of the imperial legacy. The period that followed, known as the Three Kingdoms era, saw the final disintegration of the Han Empire into competing regional powers. Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast each claimed to be the legitimate successor to the Han, but none possessed the strength to reunify the empire. For nearly a century, China was divided and weakened as these three kingdoms exhausted themselves in constant warfare. Yet even in failure, the Han dynasty had created something that would outlast any individual ruler or political system. They had established the idea of China as a unified empire with a shared culture, common institutions, and collective identity that transcended regional differences. The Han synthesis of legalist efficiency and Confucian morality had created a template for Chinese government that would be revived and refined by every subsequent dynasty. Most importantly, they had proven that Chinese civilization possessed the resilience to survive even the most severe political and military catastrophes. The fall of the Han didn't mark the end of Chinese imperial history. It marked the end of the beginning. The foundations had been laid for a civilization that would endure for 2 millennia, surviving foreign conquest, internal rebellion, and revolutionary change while maintaining its essential character and identity. The next phase of Chinese history would see the reunification of the empire under new dynasties that built upon Han achievements while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The Qin dynasty, which emerged from the chaos of the Three Kingdoms period in 280 CE, faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding Chinese unity after a century of division and warfare. Emperor Wu of Qin succeeded in reunifying the empire through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic skill, but his achievement was fragile and short-lived. The Qin never fully solved the fundamental problems that had destroyed the Han: how to govern an enormous empire effectively while maintaining the loyalty of regional commanders and the support of the population. The Qin period saw important developments in Chinese culture and technology despite political instability. The great poet Tao Yuanming created works that captured the longing for simplicity and natural beauty that would become central themes in Chinese literature. Qin craftsmen refined techniques for making porcelain that produced ceramics of unprecedented beauty and durability. Most importantly, Buddhist influence continued to grow as Chinese intellectuals found in Buddhist philosophy answers to questions that traditional Chinese thought couldn't address. But the Qin dynasty's most significant contribution to Chinese history was unintentional. They demonstrated that political unity was so valuable that Chinese people would accept almost any government that could provide it. Even weak and corrupt dynasties were preferable to the chaos and warfare that accompanied political fragmentation. This lesson would influence Chinese political thinking for centuries, creating a bias towards centralized authority that would shape the development of Chinese institutions long into the modern era. The barbarian invasions that destroyed the Western Qin dynasty in 316 CE marked the beginning of one of the most traumatic periods in Chinese history. Nomadic tribes that had been held in check by Han and Qin military power suddenly poured into northern China, establishing kingdoms that ruled over Chinese populations with varying degrees of success and brutality. The 16 Kingdoms period that followed saw constant warfare as different barbarian groups fought each other and the remnants of Chinese authority for control of the former imperial heartland. Yet even this apparent disaster contained the seeds of future Chinese greatness. The barbarian rulers who established themselves in northern China quickly discovered that they needed Chinese administrative skills and cultural knowledge to govern effectively. Many adopted Chinese customs, learned Chinese language and literature, and gradually became more Chinese than barbarian. This process of cultural assimilation would be repeated many times in Chinese history, demonstrating the power of Chinese civilization to absorb and transform even its conquerors. The period of division that lasted from 316 to 589 CE was not simply an era of chaos and decline. In southern China, the Eastern Qin and subsequent southern dynasties maintained Chinese cultural traditions while developing new forms of art, literature, and philosophy. The great calligrapher Wang Shiji created works that established the aesthetic standards for Chinese writing that are still followed today. Buddhist art and architecture reached new heights of sophistication as Chinese artists adapted Indian models to Chinese sensibilities. Northern China during this same period witnessed remarkable cultural synthesis as barbarian rulers patronized Chinese learning, while introducing new military techniques and governmental practices. The Northern Wei dynasty, established by the Tuoba clan, created one of the most successful examples of barbarian Chinese fusion government. They moved their capital to Luoyang, adopted Chinese court ceremonies, and promoted Chinese education while maintaining the military advantages that had brought them to power. The reunification of China under the Sui dynasty in 589 CE marked the end of nearly 3 centuries of division and the beginning of a new golden age that would see Chinese civilization reach unprecedented heights of power, prosperity, and cultural achievement. The Sui emperors Yang Jian and his son Yang Guang accomplished what had seemed impossible. They rebuilt Chinese unity and created the foundation for the greatest dynasty in Chinese history. But that story belongs to the next chapter of China's remarkable journey through 5,000 years of continuous civilization. The lessons of the Han period, both their triumphs and their failures, would guide Chinese rulers for centuries to come, providing a template for imperial success while also warning of the dangers that could destroy even the mightiest dynasty. The stage was set for the Tang dynasty to take Chinese civilization to heights that would amaze the world and establish China as the most advanced civilization on Earth. The Sui dynasty that emerged from this reunification wasn't just another Chinese dynasty trying to restore the past. Emperor Yang Jian, known as Emperor Wen, was a visionary who understood that rebuilding China required more than just military conquest. He needed to create institutions that could prevent the kind of regional fragmentation that had torn the empire apart for 3 centuries. What he accomplished in less than 30 years would lay the groundwork for what many historians consider the greatest period in Chinese history. Emperor Wen's first challenge was creating a government that could actually control the vast territories he had conquered. The previous period of division had created hundreds of local power centers, each with their own military forces, administrative systems, and cultural traditions. Simply declaring himself emperor wasn't enough. He needed to build a state apparatus that could reach into every village and valley, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and maintaining order on a scale that dwarfed even the Han dynasty at its peak. The solution was brilliantly simple and devastatingly effective. The Sui created a new examination system that made government service dependent on mastery of Confucian classics and demonstrated administrative competence. But unlike previous dynasties, they opened these examinations to men from all social backgrounds, creating unprecedented opportunities for advancement based purely on merit. A peasant's son who could memorize the classics and write elegant essays about government policy could theoretically rise to the highest levels of imperial administration. This wasn't just social engineering, it was a masterstroke of political control. By creating a path to power that ran through imperial examinations, the Sui made cooperation with the central government more attractive than regional independence. Local elites who might have supported warlords or separatist movements now had reasons to support imperial unity. The brightest and most ambitious young men throughout the empire focused their energies on studying for examinations rather than plotting rebellion. The Sui also revolutionized Chinese military organization in ways that would influence warfare for centuries. They created professional armies that were loyal to the emperor rather than to regional commanders. Soldiers were recruited through standardized procedures, trained in centralized facilities, and rotated between different commands to prevent them from developing local loyalties. Most importantly, the Sui developed new military technologies that gave their armies decisive advantages over any potential rivals. The crossbow technology perfected during the Sui period created weapons that could penetrate any armor and kill at distances that made traditional cavalry charges suicidal. Sui engineers developed siege engines that could breach the strongest fortifications, and their naval innovations allowed Chinese fleets to project power across vast distances. When Sui armies marched, they carried with them the most advanced military technology in the world, backed by logistical systems that could supply massive forces across enormous distances. But Emperor Wen's most ambitious project was transforming Chinese agriculture and transportation through massive infrastructure development. The Grand Canal, begun during the Sui period, would eventually stretch over 1,000 miles and connect the rice-producing regions of the south with the political centres of the north. This wasn't just an impressive engineering feat, it was an economic revolution that allowed China to support population densities and urban centres that were unmatched anywhere else in the world. The construction of the Grand Canal required mobilising millions of workers over decades of intensive labour. Entire mountains were moved, rivers were redirected, and landscapes were transformed on a scale that rivaled the pyramids of Egypt. The human cost was enormous, with hundreds of thousands of workers dying from exhaustion, disease, and accidents. But the economic benefits were even more spectacular. For the first time in Chinese history, the agricultural wealth of the south could be efficiently transported to support the administrative and military centres of the north. The Sui period also witnessed remarkable developments in Chinese culture and technology that demonstrated the creative potential unleashed by political unification. Sui craftsmen perfected techniques for making porcelain that produced ceramics of unprecedented beauty and durability. Their silk weaving reached levels of sophistication that made Chinese textiles the most prized luxury goods in the known world. Sui architects created building techniques that allowed the construction of pagodas and palaces that seemed to defy gravity. Buddhist influence reached new heights during the Sui period as emperors patronized monastery construction and supported the translation of sacred texts. The famous Mogao caves at Dunhuang, with their stunning Buddhist murals and sculptures, were expanded during this period to become one of the world's great repositories of religious art. Chinese Buddhism during the Sui period developed distinctive characteristics that blended Indian spiritual insights with Chinese aesthetic sensibilities and philosophical traditions. But the Sui dynasty's greatest achievement was also the source of its destruction. Emperor Yang Di, his who succeed father in 604 CE, inherited an empire that was more unified and powerful than China had been for centuries. Unfortunately, he also inherited his father's ambition without his father's wisdom and restraint. Yang's reign became a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial overreach and the thin line between visionary leadership and megalomaniacal destruction. Emperor Yang's first mistake was believing that Chinese power could be projected indefinitely without regard to cost or consequences. His invasion of Korea in 598 CE was supposed to demonstrate Chinese supremacy and bring tribute from the Korean kingdoms. Instead, it turned into a costly quagmire that consumed enormous resources while producing few tangible benefits. Worse, the Korean campaigns required constant military mobilization that disrupted agriculture and commerce throughout northern China. The emperor's obsession with monumental construction projects created additional strains on the empire's resources and population. Yang ordered the expansion of the Grand Canal, the construction of new palaces, and the rebuilding of the Great Wall on a scale that required millions of workers. These projects were undoubtedly impressive, but they came at a cost in human suffering that gradually undermined support for his rule. Yang's court became increasingly isolated from the realities facing ordinary Chinese people. Surrounded by flatterers and consumed by grandiose visions of imperial glory, the emperor lost touch with the practical limitations that constrained even the most powerful ruler. His demands for resources and labour became so excessive that local officials could no longer meet them without destroying the communities they governed. The rebellions that erupted across the empire in 613 CE were different from typical peasant uprisings. These weren't desperate people lashing out randomly against oppression. They were organized movements led by experienced military commanders who had concluded that the Sui government had become more dangerous to Chinese civilization than beneficial. The rebels offered a clear alternative: restore the principles of good government that had made China great under previous dynasties. Lei Yuan, the governor of Taiyuan, emerged as the most successful of these rebel leaders not because he was the most radical, but because he was the most conservative. Rather than promising to revolutionize Chinese society, Li Yuan pledged to restore the governmental principles that had made the early Sui period successful. He would maintain imperial unity while eliminating the excesses that had made Yang's rule unbearable. The fall of the Sui dynasty in 618 CE was remarkably swift for such a powerful empire. Within months of Yang's assassination, the entire governmental system collapsed as regional commanders declared independence and began fighting each other for control of imperial territory. But this kind of division was brief. The Perio. Li Yuan's military superiority and political wisdom allowed him to reunify China within a decade, establishing the Tang dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Tang dynasty represented the culmination of Chinese imperial development. Everything that previous dynasties had attempted, the Tang accomplished with a sophistication and scale that amazed contemporaries and continues to impress historians today. Under Tang rule, China became the largest, wealthiest, and most culturally advanced empire in the world, setting standards for government, military organization, and cultural achievement that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Emperor Gaozu, as Li Yuan became known, faced the same challenge that had confronted every founder of a new Chinese dynasty: how to create institutions that could maintain unity and prosperity over vast territories and diverse populations. His solution was to perfect the governmental innovations introduced by the Sui while avoiding the excesses that had destroyed his predecessors. The result was a system of imperial administration that combined unprecedented efficiency with remarkable flexibility. The Tang examination system expanded opportunities for government service to unprecedented levels, while maintaining the high standards that ensured bureaucratic competence. Tang officials were selected through competitive examinations that tested not just their knowledge of classical texts, but also their ability to write poetry, solve practical problems, and demonstrate moral character. This created a governing class that was both highly educated and genuinely committed to Confucian ideals of public service. Tang military organization represented a revolution in the way armies were recruited, trained, and deployed. The Fubing system created a professional military force that was both loyal to the central government and capable of rapid mobilization for campaigns across enormous distances. Tang armies combined the best elements of Chinese infantry traditions with nomadic cavalry techniques, creating military forces that were virtually unbeatable in open battle. The economic policies of the early Tang period demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how government regulation could promote prosperity without stifling innovation. The equal field system attempted to ensure that all peasant families had access to sufficient land for survival, while preventing the concentration of wealth that had destabilized previous dynasties. Tang currency policies created monetary stability that facilitated trade across vast distances, while their tax system generated revenues that supported the largest government apparatus in world history. But the Tang dynasty's greatest achievement was cultural rather than political or military. Under Tang rule, Chinese civilization reached levels of sophistication and creativity that influenced cultures throughout East Asia and beyond. Tang poetry, with masters like Li Bai and Du Fu, created works that are still considered among the finest achievements of human artistic expression. Tang painters developed techniques that captured both the beauty of the natural world and the complexity of human emotion with unprecedented skill. The cosmopolitan character of Tang civilization was unlike anything the world had seen before. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was probably the largest city in the world, with over 1 million inhabitants drawn from dozens of different ethnic groups and cultural backgrounds. Persian merchants, Arab diplomats, Turkish soldiers, Korean scholars, and Japanese monks all found places in Tang society, creating a cultural synthesis that enriched Chinese civilization, while spreading Chinese influence across vast distances. Tang technological achievements were equally impressive. Chinese inventors during this period created printing technology that revolutionized the way knowledge could be preserved and transmitted. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE, is the world's oldest surviving printed book, but archaeological evidence suggests that Chinese printing technology was already well developed decades earlier. This innovation would eventually spread from China to the rest of the world, fundamentally changing human civilization. The Tang period also saw remarkable developments in Chinese science and medicine. Tang astronomers created star maps and calculated celestial movements with accuracy that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. Chinese physicians during this period developed surgical techniques, pharmaceutical knowledge, and theoretical understanding of human anatomy that made Chinese medicine the most advanced in the world. The famous physician Sun Simiao compiled medical texts that are still studied today. Tang agricultural innovations supported population levels and urbanization that were unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. New crop varieties, improved farming techniques, and expanded irrigation systems allowed Chinese farmers to feed enormous populations while generating surpluses that supported the largest non-agricultural population in human history. The prosperity of Tang China attracted traders and diplomats from across the known world, making Chinese goods and ideas familiar from Korea to Constantinople. The tribute system that reached its full development during the Tang period established China as the dominant power in East Asia, while creating peaceful relationships with neighboring kingdoms. Under this system, smaller powers acknowledged Chinese supremacy and sent regular tribute missions to the Tang court in exchange for trading privileges, diplomatic protection, and cultural exchange opportunities. This arrangement benefited everyone involved while establishing Chinese civilization as the standard by which other cultures measured their own achievements. Tang influence extended far beyond China's formal borders through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The Silk Road reached its greatest development during this period, carrying Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea to markets thousands of miles away, while bringing exotic goods, new ideas, and foreign technologies to Chinese cities. Tang coins have been found in archaeological sites from Japan to the Middle East, demonstrating the extent of Chinese commercial influence. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Tang civilization was its openness to foreign influence and innovation. Unlike many successful empires that became insular and conservative, the Tang actively sought out new ideas, technologies, and cultural practices from other civilizations. They welcomed foreign merchants, scholars, and diplomats, learning from them while also sharing Chinese knowledge and techniques. This cultural exchange enriched Chinese civilization while spreading a Chinese influence across vast distances. The Tang legal system represented one of the most sophisticated attempts in human history to create laws that could govern diverse populations fairly and effectively. The Tang Code, completed in 653 CE, established legal principles and procedures that influenced East Asian legal development, for Overcode attempted to balance a millennium. The Confucian ideals of moral government with legalist principles of clear laws and consistent enforcement, creating a legal framework that was both just and practical. Tang women enjoyed greater freedom and opportunities than women in most other ancient civilizations. The most famous example is Empress Wu Zetian, who ruled China in her own right from 690 to 705 CE, becoming the only woman in Chinese history to hold the title of emperor. But Wu Zetian wasn't an isolated exception. Tang women could own property, engage in commerce, and participate in cultural and intellectual life to degrees that were remarkable for their time. The religious tolerance of the Tang period allowed Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and foreign religions to coexist and interact in ways that enriched Chinese spiritual life. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning that preserved and transmitted knowledge during periods of political instability. Taoist philosophers developed new insights about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Confucian scholars refined their understanding of ethics and government. This religious diversity created a rich intellectual environment that produced innovations in philosophy, science, and the arts. Tang military campaigns extended Chinese influence to unprecedented distances while demonstrating the superiority of Chinese military organization and technology. Tang armies conquered territories in Central Asia that brought them into contact with Arab, Persian, and Byzantine civilizations. These conquests weren't just about territorial expansion, they were about establishing Chinese civilization as the dominant force in the known world. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE, where Tang forces clashed with Arab armies in Central Asia, marked the limit of Chinese westward expansion, while also facilitating one of the most important technology transfers in human history. Chinese prisoners taken by the Arabs carried with them knowledge of paper-making techniques that would eventually spread throughout the Islamic world and into Europe. This single battle changed the course of world history by making knowledge more accessible and affordable throughout the civilized world. But even the mighty Tang dynasty carried within it the seeds of its own decline. The very success that made them great also created problems that would eventually prove insurmountable. The empire had grown so vast that governing it effectively strained even Chinese administrative capabilities. The military commanders needed to defend distant frontiers where accumulating power and independence that threatened central authority. Most dangerously, the Tang had become dependent on foreign allies and mercenaries whose loyalty was questionable at best. The An Lushan rebellion of 755 CE marked the beginning of the end for Tang greatness. An Lushan was a general of foreign origin who commanded Tang forces on the northeastern frontier. His rebellion wasn't just a military uprising government. It was a fundamental Tang system of challenge to the entire nearly 8 years. The rebellion tore the T Empire apart, destroying the economic foundations of Tang prosperity and revealing the military weaknesses that had developed during decades of peace and luxury. The Tang dynasty survived the An Lushan rebellion, but they never fully recovered their former strength and unity. The central government was forced to rely increasingly on regional military governors who ruled their territories with virtual independence. These warlords paid service to imperial lip authority while building their own power bases and pursuing their own interests. The empire that the most had once been centralized and efficient government in the world gradually fragmented into competing power centers. The final century of Tang rule, from 755 to 907 CE, witnessed the slow decline of Chinese imperial power and the gradual erosion of the institutions that had made China great. Natural disasters, military defeats, and administrative corruption combined to undermine the dynasty's ability to govern effectively. Regional rebellions became increasingly common as local leaders concluded that the Tang government was too weak to maintain order or provide protection. Yet, even in decline, the Tang dynasty's cultural and institutional legacy continued to influence Chinese civilization and spread Chinese ideas throughout East Asia. The governmental systems they had perfected became the standard template for imperial administration that would be used by every subsequent dynasty. Their cultural achievements established artistic and literary standards that influenced Chinese creativity for centuries. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that Chinese civilization possessed the capacity to absorb and integrate influences from other cultures while maintaining its essential character and identity. The fall of the Tang dynasty in 907 CE marked the end of what many historians consider the golden age of Chinese civilization, but it didn't mark the end of Chinese imperial history. The foundations they had laid, administrative, military, cultural, and technological, would be rebuilt and refined by subsequent dynasties that continued the long march of Chinese civilization through 5,000 years of continuous development. The Five Dynasties period that followed Tang collapse saw China once again divided among competing regional powers, each claiming to be the legitimate successor to imperial authority. But this time, the period of division was relatively brief. The institutional foundations created by the Tang were too strong to be permanently destroyed, and the economic and cultural achievements of Chinese civilization were too valuable to be abandoned. Within 50 years, new rulers would emerge who understood how to rebuild Chinese unity, while adapting to the changed circumstances of a more complex and interconnected world. The stage was set for the Song dynasty, to take Chinese civilization in new directions that would establish China as the most technologically advanced and economically sophisticated civilization in the medieval world. The lessons learned from Tang's successes and failures would guide Chinese rulers as they faced new challenges from nomadic empires, technological revolutions, and the growing complexity of governing an increasingly urban and commercial society. But that remarkable story of Chinese adaptation and innovation belongs to the next chapter of this 5,000-year journey through the rise and fall of dynasties, the development of the world's most enduring civilization, and the continuing evolution of the Middle Kingdom that would eventually become modern China. The Song dynasty that emerged from the chaos of the Five Dynasties period in 960 CE faced a challenge that would have seemed impossible to earlier Chinese rulers. They needed to rebuild imperial unity without the massive armies and territorial control that had made previous dynasties great. The Song would accomplish something even more remarkable. They created the most innovative and prosperous civilization in medieval world history while being militarily weaker than any major Chinese dynasty before them. Zhou, who founded the Song as Emperor Taizu, understood something that his predecessors had missed. Military conquest alone couldn't create lasting stability in an empire as vast and complex as China had become. Instead of trying to recreate Tang military dominance, he focused on building governmental and economic systems that would uphold rebellion, rowfightable and cooperation attractive. His approach was revolutionary, and its success would transform not just China, but the entire world. The Song examination system expanded beyond anything previous dynasties had attempted, creating opportunities for advancement that reached deeper into Chinese society than ever before. But this wasn't just about social mobility. It was about creating a governing class whose loyalty came from gratitude rather than fear, whose competence came from rigorous testing rather than hereditary privilege. Song officials knew they owed their positions to imperial favour and scholarly achievement, making them natural supporters of centralised authority. What made the Song system truly revolutionary was its emphasis on civilian control of the military. Previous dynasties had been destroyed when powerful generals became independent warlords. The Song prevented this by rotating military commands frequently, dividing authority between multiple officers and ensuring that supply and logistics remained under civilian control. Song armies might not have been the most powerful in Chinese history, but they were certainly the most reliable and loyal to central authority. The economic innovations of the Song period were even more impressive than their governmental reforms. Song China became the first civilization in human history to develop a fully monetized economy with paper currency, credit systems, and commercial banking. Chinese merchants during this period created business techniques and financial instruments that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries. The prosperity this generated was unprecedented in scale and sophistication. Song agricultural productivity reached levels that supported the largest urban population the world had ever seen. Chinese farmers developed new crops, improved farming techniques, and created agricultural systems that could feed enormous populations while generating surpluses for trade and manufacturing. The famous agricultural treatises of the Song period documented farming methods that increased yields far beyond what previous generations had thought possible. But the Song dynasty's greatest achievement was technological. Chinese inventors during this period created innovations that would eventually transform human civilization. The compass revolutionized navigation and made possible the age of exploration that would connect all the world's oceans. Gunpowder changed warfare forever, making traditional fortifications obsolete and creating new possibilities for both destruction and construction. Printing technology reached new levels of sophistication that made books affordable and knowledge accessible to unprecedented numbers of people. Song metallurgy achieved breakthroughs that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for centuries. Chinese engineers learned to produce steel in quantities and qualities that supported massive construction projects and manufacturing industries. Their techniques for working iron, copper, and other metals created tools and weapons that were superior to anything produced elsewhere. The famous Kaifeng iron and steel industry employed hundreds of thousands of workers and produced goods that were traded across Asia. The urban centers that emerged during the Song period were unlike anything the world had seen before. Kaifeng, the Song capital, may have had over 1 million inhabitants, making it probably the largest city in the world at the time. But size alone wasn't what made Song cities remarkable. They were centers of commerce, manufacturing, and intellectual activity that created new forms of urban life and social organization. Song commercial innovations created the world's first truly global economy. Chinese networks that extended merchants established trading from Korea to the Indian Ocean, carrying Chinese goods to markets thousands of miles away while bringing exotic products back to Chinese cities. The credit instruments and banking systems they developed made possible commercial transactions across vast distances, without the need to transport actual currency. The scientific achievements of the Song period established China as the most technologically advanced civilization in the world. Chinese astronomers created star maps and calculated celestial movements with unprecedented accuracy. Song mathematicians developed algebraic techniques and geometric principles that were centuries ahead of developments elsewhere. Their understanding of physics, chemistry, and engineering produced innovations that changed the way humans interacted with the natural world. Song medicine reached levels of sophistication that made Chinese physicians the most skilled healers in the world. They developed surgical techniques, pharmaceutical knowledge, and theoretical understanding of human anatomy that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. The famous medical texts compiled during the Song period documented treatments and procedures that saved countless lives while advancing human understanding of disease and healing. The cultural achievements of the Song period were equally impressive. Song poets and artists created works that are still considered among the finest examples of human creative expression. Their landscape paintings captured the beauty of the natural world with techniques that influenced Asian art for centuries. Song literature developed new forms and styles that explored human nature and social relationships with unprecedented depth and subtlety. Neo-Confucianism, the philosophical synthesis that emerged during the Song period, created new ways of understanding the relationship between human nature, social organization, and cosmic order. Thin that integrated Confucian ethics cures like Zhou developed theories with Buddhist and Taoist insights about the nature of reality. Their work created intellectual frameworks that would influence East Asian thought for the next 1,000 years. But the Song dynasty's greatest weakness was also a consequence of their greatest strength. The prosperity and sophistication of Song civilization made them attractive targets for neighboring powers who coveted Chinese wealth and technology. The Khitan-Liao dynasty in the north and the Tangut-Western Xia in the northwest were nomadic empires that had adopted Chinese governmental techniques while maintaining the military advantages of nomadic society. The Song response to these military threats revealed both their wisdom and their limitations. Rather than bankrupting themselves in constant warfare, they chose to pay tribute to their nomadic neighbors in exchange for peace and security. This policy was economically rational and politically sensible, but it created psychological problems that would haunt the dynasty for centuries. Many Chinese intellectuals believed that paying tribute to barbarians was a humiliation that undermined the moral authority of imperial rule. The Qin dynasty, which conquered northern China in 1127 CE, represented a new type of nomadic empire that combined military effectiveness with sophisticated understanding of Chinese civilization. The Jurchen people who founded the Qin had learned from previous nomadic conquerors, adopting Chinese administrative techniques while maintaining their military superiority. Their conquest of the Song capital forced the dynasty to flee south, creating the Southern Song period that would last until 1279 CE. The Southern Song period demonstrated the resilience of Chinese civilization even under extreme adversity. Cut off from traditional agricultural and industrial centers, the Song rebuilt their economy and government in southern China while continuing to innovate in technology, commerce, and culture. Southern Song cities became even more prosperous and sophisticated than their northern predecessors, proving that Chinese civilization could adapt and thrive under almost any circumstances. Song naval technology reached unprecedented levels of sophistication as the dynasty was forced to rely increasingly on waterways for defense. Chinese and commerce shipbuilders created vessels that were larger, more seaworthy, and more technologically advanced than anything produced elsewhere. Song fleets projected Chinese power across the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean, establishing trading relationships and diplomatic contacts that extended Chinese influence far beyond their territorial borders. The magnetic compass perfected during the Song period revolutionized navigation and made possible the great age of exploration that would eventually connect all the world's oceans. Chinese navigators were using compass technology for oceanic voyages centuries before it appeared in Europe, giving them crucial advantages in long-distance trade and naval warfare. This innovation alone would change the course of world history. Song printing technology achieved levels of sophistication that made books mass-produced commodities for the first time in human history. The famous Kaifeng printing industry produced texts in quantities that were unimaginable to previous generations, making knowledge accessible to unprecedented numbers of people. This technological revolution created new possibilities for education, government administration, and cultural development that would influence civilizations throughout East Asia. The paper money invented during the Song period solved practical problems of commerce while creating entirely new possibilities for economic development. Chinese merchants could conduct business across vast distances without the risks and inconveniences of transporting metal currency. The credit systems and banking networks that supported paper money created financial instruments that facilitated trade and investment on scales that had never been possible before. Song industrial development reached levels that wouldn't be matched elsewhere until the Industrial Revolution. Chinese manufacturers produced textiles, ceramics, and metal goods in quantities that supplied markets throughout Asia. Their techniques for organizing production, managing labor, and distributing goods created industrial systems that were centuries ahead of developments in other civilizations. The social changes that accompanied Song economic development created new forms of urban life and social organization that influenced Chinese society for centuries. Song cities were centers of commerce and culture that attracted people from all social backgrounds, creating opportunities for advancement and social mobility that were unprecedented in scale. The merchant classes that emerged during this period would play increasingly important roles in Chinese society and politics. Song agricultural innovations supported population densities that were unmatched anywhere else in the medieval world. New crops introduced from Southeast Asia, improved farming techniques, and expanded irrigation systems allowed Chinese farmers to feed enormous populations while generating surpluses for trade and manufacturing. The agricultural treatises compiled during this period documented farming methods that increased productivity far beyond what previous generations had achieved. The examination system reached its full development during the Song period, creating opportunities for government service that extended throughout Chinese society. Song examinations tested not just knowledge of classical texts, but also practical skills needed for effective administration. This created a governing class that was both highly educated and genuinely competent, setting standards for bureaucratic excellence that would influence Chinese government for centuries. But the Song dynasty also faced internal challenges that would eventually contribute to their downfall. The prosperity and sophistication of Song civilization created social tensions between different groups competing for wealth and status. The examination system, while more meritocratic than previous arrangements, still favored those wealthy enough to afford extensive education. Regional differences became more pronounced as different areas specialized in different types of economic activity. The philosophical debates of the Song period reflected deeper tensions about the direction of Chinese civilization. Neo-Confucian thinkers argued about whether Chinese society should emphasize moral cultivation or practical effectiveness, whether government should focus on maintaining traditional values or adapting to changing circumstances. These debates weren't just academic exercises. They reflected real disagreements about how China should respond to the challenges of governing an increasingly complex and interconnected world. Song military innovations attempted to compensate for numerical disadvantages through technological superiority. Chinese engineers developed early firearms that gave Song armies advantages over traditional weapons. Their use of gunpowder in military applications created new possibilities for both offensive and defensive warfare. But these innovations couldn't overcome the fundamental problem that Song armies were smaller and less experienced than those of their nomadic neighbors. The Mongol invasions that ultimately destroyed the Song dynasty represented the greatest military challenge Chinese civilization had ever faced. The Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors created the largest empire in human history through military techniques and organizational methods that were specifically designed to overcome the advantages of settled civilizations like China. Their conquest of the Song wouldn't just end a dynasty, it would test whether Chinese civilization could survive under foreign rule. Yet even as the Song dynasty faced its final crisis, their achievements were transforming the world in ways that would outlast any political system. Song innovations in technology, commerce, and government were spreading throughout Asia and beyond, carrying Chinese influence to civilizations that had never been in direct contact with China. The compass, gunpowder, and printing technology would eventually reach Europe and contribute to the transformations that created the modern world. The fall of the Song dynasty in 1279 CE marked the end of what many historians consider the most innovative period in Chinese history, but their legacy would prove more durable than their political power. The governmental, economic, and technological foundations they had created would be rebuilt and refined by subsequent dynasties, ensuring that Chinese civilization would continue its remarkable journey through 5,000 years of continuous development. The Mongol Yuan dynasty that conquered the Song would face the challenge of governing the most sophisticated civilization in the world, with administrative and military techniques designed for nomadic society. Their success or failure would determine whether Chinese civilization could maintain its essential character under foreign rule, or whether the conquest would mark a fundamental break in the continuity that had defined Chinese development for millennia. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable experiments in world history, the attempt by nomadic conquerors to govern the most advanced sedentary civilization on Earth. The outcome would influence not just China's future, but the development of the entire Eurasian world system that was emerging from the connections created by Mongol expansion and Chinese innovation. The Mongol conquest of China wasn't just another dynastic transition, it was a collision between two completely different ways of understanding the world. The Mongols had built the largest empire in human history through mobility, adaptability, and the complete destruction of everything that stood in their way. The Chinese had created the most sophisticated civilization on Earth through stability, tradition, and the gradual refinement of institutions over thousands of years. When these two forces met, the result would reshape both civilizations forever. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan who completed the conquest of Song China, faced a problem that no nomadic ruler had ever successfully solved. How do you govern a sedentary civilization of over 60 million people when your entire cultural background is based on movement, flexibility, and the rejection of permanent institutions? The traditional Mongol approach would have been to destroy Chinese cities, eliminate the educated classes, and convert farmland back to pasture. But Kublai understood something his predecessors had missed. Chinese wealth came from the very complexity that made it difficult to govern. The solution Kublai developed was revolutionary in its implications for both Mongol and Chinese civilization. Rather than destroying Chinese institutions, he would adapt them to serve Mongol interests. Rather than eliminating Chinese culture, he would position himself as its protector and patron. Most importantly, rather than ruling China as conquered territory, he would present himself as a legitimate Chinese emperor who happened to be of Mongol origin. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai established in 1271 CE represented the first successful attempt in Chinese history to combine foreign military dominance with Chinese administrative sophistication. Kublai kept Mongol control over the military and key government positions while utilizing Chinese officials for the complex work of taxation, law enforcement, and economic management. This dual system allowed the Mongols to maintain their political supremacy while benefiting from Chinese expertise in governing large populations. But Kublai's most brilliant Chinese innovation was his approach cultural identity. Rather than suppressing Chinese traditions, he actively promoted them as symbols of his legitimacy as emperor. He patronized Chinese artists, supported Confucian education, and maintained the examination system that had been the foundation of Chinese government for centuries. By presenting himself as the defender of Chinese civilization rather than its conqueror, Kublai won the GRU of managing acceptance Chinese intellectuals who might otherwise have supported resistance movements. The economic policies of the Yuan dynasty demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of what made Chinese civilization prosperous. Kublai expanded the Grand Canal, rebuilt cities destroyed during the conquest, and promoted trade on a scale that dwarfed even Song achievements. The Yuan capital at Beijing became the terminus of trade routes that stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe, making it the commercial center of the largest economic system the world had ever seen. Yuan technological development built upon Song innovations while adding new elements derived from contacts with other parts of the Mongol Empire. Chinese engineers gained access to Persian astronomical instruments, Islamic mathematical techniques, and European mechanical devices, creating a synthesis of knowledge that pushed Chinese technology to new heights. The Yuan period saw improvements in navigation, metallurgy, and manufacturing that kept China ahead of the rest of the world in technological sophistication. The Yuan legal system attempted to balance Mongol customs with Chinese legal traditions, creating a complex arrangement that recognized different laws for different ethnic groups. Mongols were governed by traditional steppe law, Chinese followed modified versions of Tang and Song legal codes, and other ethnic groups maintained their own legal traditions under oversight Yuan. This pluralistic approach was unprecedented in Chinese history and demonstrated the pragmatic flexibility that made Yuan rule possible. But the Yuan dynasty also revealed the fundamental tensions that would plague any attempt to combine nomadic and sedentary civilizations. Mongol nobles resented the influence of Chinese advisors and the constraints imposed by governing a settled population. Chinese intellectuals chafed under foreign rule and the secondary status assigned to Chinese officials in their own country. These tensions would eventually tear the dynasty apart, but for over a century they created a unique synthesis that enriched both cultures. The Yuan period witnessed some of the most remarkable cultural achievements in Chinese history. Yuan drama reached new heights of sophistication, with playwrights creating works that combined Chinese literary traditions with influences from across the Mongol Empire. Yuan painting developed new styles that incorporated Persian and Central Asian artistic techniques while maintaining distinctively Chinese characteristics. Most importantly, Yuan scholars began the process of integrating knowledge from different civilizations into comprehensive systems that would influence Chinese thought for centuries. Marco Polo's famous account of his travels in Yuan China provides a European perspective on the most advanced civilization of the medieval world. His descriptions of Chinese cities, technology, and government amazed European readers and contributed to the growing European interest in Asian trade and culture. But Polo's account also reveals the cosmopolitan character of Yuan China, where merchants and diplomats from dozens of different cultures conducted business and exchanged ideas on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. The Yuan monetary system represented one of the most sophisticated attempts in medieval history to create a stable currency for a vast empire. Building on Song innovations in paper money, the Yuan created a currency system that was accepted from Korea to Central Asia, facilitating trade and economic development across enormous distances. Their understanding of monetary policy and inflation was centuries ahead of developments in other civilizations and demonstrated the continued sophistication of Chinese economic thinking under foreign rule. Yuan naval expeditions projected Chinese power across the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean on a scale that anticipated the famous Ming voyages of the following century. Chinese shipbuilding technology during the Yuan period produced vessels that were larger and more seaworthy than anything produced elsewhere, allowing Chinese merchants and diplomats to establish trading relationships and diplomatic contacts throughout maritime Asia. The attempted Yuan invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 CE demonstrated both the military capabilities and the limitations of Mongol power. These massive expeditions, involving hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of ships, represented the largest seaborne invasions in history up to that point. Their failure due to storms that the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine wind, marked the first major military defeat suffered by the Mongol Empire and demonstrated that even Mongol military superiority had geographical and logistical limits. Agricultural development during the Yuan period built upon Song innovations while adding new crops and farming techniques derived from contacts with other parts of the Mongol Empire. Chinese farmers gained access to new varieties of cotton, improved irrigation techniques, and better understanding of crop rotation that increased agricultural productivity. The Yuan government actively promoted agricultural development through investment in infrastructure and research, recognizing that Chinese prosperity depended on maintaining high levels of agricultural production. The Yuan examination system modified traditional Chinese practices while maintaining their essential character. Yuan examinations included questions about Mongol history and customs, alongside traditional tests of Chinese classical knowledge, creating a hybrid system that reflected the multicultural character of Yuan government. This adaptation demonstrated the flexibility of Chinese institutions and their ability to incorporate foreign elements while maintaining their fundamental purposes. Yuan religious policy demonstrated remarkable tolerance for the diversity of beliefs within the empire. Buddhism continued to flourish under Yuan patronage, while Taoism and Confucianism maintained their traditional roles in Chinese society. The Yuan also supported Islamic communities, Nestorian Christians, and other religious minorities, creating a level of religious diversity and tolerance that was unusual for medieval civilizations. But the seeds of its eventual success of Yuan rule contained downfall. As generations passed, Mongol rulers became increasingly Chinese in their attitudes and behavior, losing the military edge that had made conquest possible while failing to win complete acceptance from Chinese subjects who still regarded them as foreigners. The Yuan faced the classic dilemma of foreign conquerors. They could maintain their distinct identity and remain outsiders, or they could assimilate into Chinese culture and lose their unique advantages. Natural disasters during the 14th century placed enormous strains on Yuan resources and administrative capabilities. The Yellow River changed course multiple times, causing floods that displaced millions of people and disrupted agricultural production throughout northern China. These disasters required massive government intervention and expenditure at a time when Yuan finances were already strained by the costs of maintaining a vast empire and supporting an elaborate court system. The Red Turban rebellions that began in the 1350s represented more than just peasant uprisings against oppressive government. They were expressions of Chinese nationalism that rejected foreign rule and called for the restoration of native Chinese government. The rebels drew upon Buddhist and Taoist religious traditions to create ideologies that appealed to Chinese cultural identity, while promising to restore the prosperity and order that had characterized earlier Chinese dynasties. Zhou Yuanzhang, the peasant who emerged as the most successful of the anti-Yuan, something that rebels, understood other rebel leaders had missed. Military victory against the Yuan would only be meaningful if it led to the creation of a government that could provide better administration than foreign rule. His success in building an effective rebel government while conducting military campaigns demonstrated the organizational skills that would make him one of the most effective founders in Chinese history. The fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368 CE marked the end of the only successful foreign conquest of all of China until the 20th century. But the Yuan period had permanently changed Chinese civilization by demonstrating that Chinese institutions were flexible enough to function under foreign leadership, and that Chinese culture was resilient enough to maintain its essential character even under alien rule. These lessons would prove crucial when China faced later challenges from foreign powers. The Ming dynasty that emerged from the anti-Yuan rebellions would face the challenge of rebuilding Chinese institutions while learning from the Yuan experience. They would need to restore the legitimacy of native Chinese rule while maintaining the cosmopolitan connections that had made Yuan China prosperous and influential. Their success or failure would determine whether Chinese civilization could combine traditional values with the innovations needed to thrive in an increasingly interconnected world. Zhou Yuanzhang, who became Emperor Hongwu of the Ming dynasty, represented something unprecedented in Chinese history. He was a peasant who had risen to become emperor through military skill and political acumen rather than noble birth or scholarly achievement. His reign would establish patterns of Ming rule that emphasized centralized control, cultural orthodoxy, and suspicion of foreign influence that would define Chinese government for the next 3 centuries. The early Ming period witnessed one of the most remarkable attempts in history to restore traditional civilization after foreign conquest. Emperor Hongwu and his successors worked systematically to eliminate Yuan influences, while rebuilding Chinese institutions on traditional foundations. They restored the examination system to its classical form, rebuilt Confucian academies, and promoted Chinese cultural practices that had been neglected or suppressed during the Yuan period. But the Ming couldn't simply recreate the past. The Yuan period had changed China too fundamentally for any dynasty to ignore the lessons learned during nearly a century of foreign rule. Ming emperors adopted Yuan administrative techniques, maintained trading relationships established during the Yuan period, and continued technological developments that had begun under Mongol patronage. The result was a dynasty that was both thoroughly Chinese in its cultural identity and remarkably sophisticated in its governmental and economic practices. The Ming capital at Nanjing and later Beijing became the center of the most powerful and prosperous empire in the world during the late 14th century and early 15th centuries. Ming China during this period was larger, wealthier, and more technologically advanced than any contemporary civilization, setting standards for government, military organization, and cultural achievement that influenced development throughout East Asia and beyond. The Yongle Emperor, who ruled from 1402 to 1424 CE, represented the pinnacle of Ming power and ambition. His reign saw Chinese influence extend to unprecedented distances through military campaigns, diplomatic missions, and the famous treasure fleets commanded by the Admiral Zhang He. These expeditions projected Chinese power across the Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia, India, Persia, Arabia, and the eastern coast of Africa, demonstrating that Chinese naval technology and organizational capabilities were unmatched anywhere in the world. The treasure fleets of Zheng He were unlike anything the world had ever seen. The largest ships in these fleets were over 400 feet long and could carry crews of nearly 1,000 men, making them larger than any vessels that would be built in Europe for centuries. These expeditions weren't just displays of Chinese power, they were sophisticated diplomatic and commercial missions that established Chinese influence throughout the Indian Ocean world, while bringing back exotic goods, tribute, and knowledge that enriched Chinese civilization. But the Ming decision to abandon these expeditions after the 1430s would have profound consequences for both Chinese and world history. The costs of maintaining such massive fleets, combined with military pressures on China's northern frontiers, led Ming emperors to conclude that resources would be better spent on defending established territories rather than exploring new ones. This decision left the Indian Ocean open to later European expansion and marked the beginning of China's gradual withdrawal from active engagement with the wider world. The Ming period also witnessed the completion of the Great Wall in the form that modern tourists recognize. Unlike earlier walls built by previous dynasties, the Ming Wall was a comprehensive defensive system that stretched for thousands of miles and incorporated the most advanced fortification technology available. The construction of this wall required mobilizing millions of workers over centuries and represented one of the largest construction projects in human history. Ming agricultural development reached new heights through the introduction of New World crops that revolutionized Chinese farming. Maize, sweet potatoes, and other American plants allowed Chinese farmers to cultivate previously marginal lands and support population densities that had never been achieved before. These agricultural innovations contributed to a population explosion that would make China the most populous country in the world and create the demographic foundation for later Chinese influence and power. The Ming examination system reached its most refined form during this period, creating opportunities for advancement that extended throughout Chinese society, while maintaining standards of excellence that ensured bureaucratic competence. Ming examinations were more rigorous and comprehensive than those of any previous dynasty, testing not just knowledge of classical texts, but also practical skills needed for effective government administration. Ming technological development continued Chinese leadership in fields ranging from metallurgy to navigation to manufacturing. Chinese craftsmen during this period perfected techniques for making porcelain that produced ceramics of unprecedented beauty and durability. Ming silk weaving, lacquerware production, and other luxury crafts created goods that were prized throughout Asia and eventually Europe, generating wealth that supported the largest government apparatus in the world. But the Ming dynasty also began to exhibit characteristics that would eventually limit Chinese adaptability and innovation. The emphasis on restoring traditional Chinese civilization led to increasing cultural conservatism and suspicion of foreign ideas. The examination system, while meritocratic in principle, became increasingly rigid in practice, discouraging the kind of intellectual innovation that had characterized earlier periods of Chinese history. The Ming military system, despite its impressive fortifications and large armies, gradually became less effective as it faced new types of challenges from emerging nomadic powers and later European military technology. The dynasty that had begun with such military success found itself increasingly on the defensive as new threats emerged that required different kinds of responses than traditional Chinese military organization could provide effectively. The later Ming period, from the late 16th to the mid-17th centuries, witnessed growing internal problems that would eventually contribute to dynastic collapse. Population growth had outstripped agricultural development in many regions, creating social tensions and economic pressures that strained governmental resources. Natural disasters, including floods, droughts, and earthquakes, placed additional burdens on an administrative system that was already stretched to its limits. The Wanli Emperor's reign from 1572 to 1620 CE exemplified the problems that were weakening Ming rule. His refusal to attend court sessions or make necessary governmental decisions paralyzed the imperial administration for decades, creating a power vacuum that was filled by court eunuchs whose influence undermined the traditional balance between different branches of government. This administrative dysfunction occurred at precisely the time when China faced new external threats that required decisive leadership and effective coordination. The rise of the Manchus in the northeast represented a new type of challenge that combined traditional nomadic military advantages with sophisticated understanding of Chinese governmental techniques. The Manchu leaders had learned from previous nomadic conquerors, adopting Chinese administrative methods while maintaining their military superiority and cultural identity. Their success in unifying the northeastern tribes created a power that would eventually prove capable of conquering all of China. And there you have it. 5,000 years of Chinese civilization, from Bronze Age settlements along the Yellow River to the emergence of the Manchus, who would establish the last imperial dynasty. We've witnessed the rise and fall of over 20 dynasties, each one contributing something unique to the continuous thread of Chinese civilization that somehow survived every catastrophe, invasion, and revolution thrown at it. What makes this story truly remarkable isn't just the longevity, but the adaptability. Chinese civilization absorbed Mongol conquerors, integrated Buddhist philosophy, survived devastating rebellions, and continuously reinvented itself while maintaining its essential character. The innovations we've explored — paper, gunpowder, the compass, printing, the examination system — didn't just change China, they transformed the entire world. Today, as China emerges as a modern superpower, understanding this incredible journey isn't just fascinating history, it's the key to understanding where our world is headed next.